Hello, I'm Crause. For those of you who don't know me, by the time I'm finished tonight, you should know me pretty well. But for those of you who already know me, those of you already involved with the ministry that we've been engaged in, you probably saw that recently Daphne and I said that we were stepping down from the holding the reins of the leadership ministry of Global Business Ministries, and we were going to go into a semi-retirement. Now, I don't like the word retirement. I've always said I will retire when I stop breathing, and I still hold to that. We've not retired. We've actually just shifted into a different phase of our ministry, and contrary to what many may think, we will not be disappearing at all. In fact, you may see more of us in the future than you've seen of us in the past. And once I explain to you where we're going, perhaps you'll understand that better. Okay, so to put you all into the picture, those of you who already know us, those of you who are meeting us for the first time, Daphne and I are going to share our story, a very quick breakdown of my life story. If I were to give you my whole life story, you will be here for at least a week. God has done so much in my life. I sat down recently, tried to write a biography, and there was just so much. I just wasn't sure what to include. Eventually, I just gave it up. It's just too vast. Okay, perhaps in time, the Lord may lead me to put pieces of it together. And not that I want to speak about myself, but God has done so much in my life and in Daphne's life, and I want you to understand where we're coming from. So that's why I'm going to give you a quick breakdown. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. I was born into a Christian home. My parents were born-again, Spirit-filled believers, Pentecostal believers. Their parents were also born-again, Spirit-filled Pentecostal believers. I come from a couple of generations of very committed Christians. So I grew up in the Lord. I grew up in the knowledge of the Lord. I grew up in Sunday school and being taught the ways of the Lord, and I have known the Lord all my life. I just accepted the Lord naturally as a child. I can't say I can point to a moment in time where I was born again as such. But I grew up as a believer, but I grew up as a non-victorious believer. I went to Sunday school. I went to church. I was involved in just warming the pews like many people are today. I never really got involved much in anything. Okay. As I grew up, went through my teen years, I maintained my commitment to the Lord, but because of that, very often I never seemed to have any friends, anybody wanted to associate with me. I wanted to witness to people and speak about the Lord because I was told that was the right thing to do. Okay. And so as I grew up and reached particularly the mid and later teen years, I reached the point where I thought, did I waste my time all these years being a Christian? You know, all my friends, they're going out, they've got relationships, they got friendships, they got a social life, and here I am. All I ever do is go to church. And so for a season, I went through a period of rebellion where I thought, let me go try the world and see what it's like. Let me go out and do the things that they do. Let me speak the kind of language that they speak. And if you knew me at that stage, you would not have believed that I was a Christian. Not that I got bad. I just, for a season, just threw off all restraint. And I got weary of being a Christian. I began to turn to the world. Well, that didn't last long because I found out that I was more miserable then than I was before. And so at the age of 19, I made a fresh commitment to the Lord, came back and gave myself wholly to Him. And I think that was my first real strong commitment that I made by choice. Although I'd grown up in a Pentecostal church, I'd never received the baptism of the Holy Spirit. I've been prayed for many times, but it never happened. But a year later, at a youth camp that I attended, largely just to meet girls, but God got a hold of me at that camp. His Spirit got a hold of me, and I got filled with the Holy Spirit in a very dramatic and exciting way at that camp. And I came back full of the Lord, full of his power and his glory, and excited about being a Christian. And for the first time, the idea came into my mind, wow, I would love to do something for the Lord. I would love to maybe even preach or do something like that. And so my spiritual life exploded, and it took off from that point. God brought into my life somebody that I fell in love with. We became engaged and we got married. I settled down. In a period of time, we had 3 daughters together, and I had such a passion to go into the work of the Lord. I wanted to study. I wanted to go into ministry, but it seemed like I got held back. It's just like there weren't opportunities. And eventually, at the age of 28, finally, after having to move from the church where we were into another church, and even another, eventually the time came when somebody recognized that God had placed a call on my life, and I was finally placed into the ministry. Then for the first time, my ministry began to flourish. And because in all those years of preparation, I did so much studying and going into the scriptures and reading so many books, what became very clear to everyone was that I had a teaching ministry. And so as I came into ministry, met some of the fellow ministers in the denomination in which I was ordained, which was the Assemblies of God at that time in Zimbabwe, which was known as Rhodesia at that time. Everybody recognized my teaching ministry. The ministers all made a big fuss of me. They even got me to be a speaker at one of their conferences. And wow, everything looked so good. And it was going good for a while. I struggled in my first ministry. It was a difficult church. I eventually was brought back into the headquarters to work as an assistant minister with the main minister in the denomination. And everything was going great. The people loved my ministry. But then disaster hit the country. There was economic downturn. There was political upheaval. There was change in government, the sort of things that happened in so many countries in Africa. And as a result of that, I was told that they could no longer support me in full-time ministry, and I would have to go back to secular work. Well, in Zimbabwe at that time, the situation was not very good economically. So the logical thing for me to do if I was going to go back to work was to come back to South Africa, which is where I was born. Even though I'd grown up in Zimbabwe, I was born in South Africa. It was my homeland. And so taking my wife and 3 daughters, we climbed on a plane and we came to South Africa at the tender age of 29. I'd been in the ministry for about a year. I'd been recognized and ordained, but there were no openings in South Africa. I was told to settle in a local church until an opportunity came up. And so I tried to settle into various different Assembly of God churches that were here in South Africa. And I was very zealous for the Lord, very young and full of fire, wanting to preach and teach. And of course, the assemblies had opportunity once a week that have an open meeting where I could share. People responded to my ministry, and it was wonderful. But inevitably, the minister who was in charge didn't like the people responding to my ministry instead of his ministry. And well, eventually it came to conflict. And I thought, I can't stay here. I don't want to be the source of conflict. And so I pulled out, tried another church, and this went on for a few times. And eventually I came to the conclusion, I'm not going to fit into the church system. It's going to be a problem. I might as well just stay home. And so we stayed home. And I began to wait on the Lord. And God began to lead me to spend time with him. For a season, he had me not only not be involved in the church system, but to actually even leave my job and to wait on him full time. It was a huge step of faith. I didn't know where my money was going to come from, but I was going to trust God to provide our needs. And we lived that way for 9 months. It was extremely difficult. But during that time, I got to know the Lord Jesus. He appeared to me in a vision, and he began to teach me the realm of the Spirit. And so I went through a time of training in the spiritual realm, in a more prophetic realm. And during that time, God began to show me things that I'd never learned or seen before. That was the first real preparation for my ministry. And then the Lord led us to sell up everything that we had and move down. We were in Johannesburg. We moved down to the coast to Port Elizabeth. And in Port Elizabeth, I just settled into a big church there, didn't get involved, and made myself available to the Lord and said, Lord, where do you want me to go? God gave me opportunity to minister in little groups that were meeting outside of the church. Somehow somebody found out about me. They found that I flowed in prophetic ministry. They invited me to speak to some of their groups. God began to use me. People loved my ministry. It was going great. And again, things were difficult. The Lord allowed me to take a job, to be employed for a season. I had a company car, and so I could do the sideline ministry and work. And I got into computers, which I'd always loved. Now I got a career and a ministry flowing together. It was wonderful. And again, economic disaster struck. The person that was employing me, his business began to go down. He couldn't afford to keep me anymore. I had to leave. Where to now? What do we do? The only thing we could do was to come back to Johannesburg. And so while I was down in Port Elizabeth, the Lord completed my prophetic training. And in one of the little groups there, somebody prayed with me, took my hands, and spoke a release over me. And I was released at that time into the prophetic ministry. And so we came back to Johannesburg. I got a job. Now, having had some experience in computers, I got a job with computers, and that was a wonderful job, and I enjoyed it. And so ministry became just a sideline idea. If somebody came to our home and they needed ministry, or if we visited somebody and they needed ministry, I would end up ministering to them. But there was no real active ministry at all. And then I met an old associate that I'd met at one stage while I was doing some ministry training, and he'd started a church, and he said, Les, come and work with me as an assistant pastor in my church. And I said, well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So he had great ideas. He'd started his own little Bible school in the church, and he said, I'd like you to come and be one of the lecturers. So that was great. So I was working as assistant pastor, doing some lecturing, and then I picked on one of my favorite subjects. I loved counseling, speaking about problems. I began to teach on marriage. I'd had a lot of problems in my own marriage that I felt I had solved, and God had taught me some good principles in marriage. I began to hold this this course on marriage, and while I was teaching other people how to fix their marriage, my wife started to have an affair behind my back with somebody else. Oh, Lord. What a disaster. What a disaster. Satan struck me where it hurt the most. Yeah, I was trying to tell people how to fix their marriages, and my own marriage fell apart. And eventually, it led to divorce. We divorced scripturally. We divorced amicably. We parted in the love of the Lord, and each went our own ways. And now I was waiting on the Lord to say, where do I go from here? Lord, give me a wife that will stand with me in the work. And so God brought me Daphne in a miraculous way, and we shared our story so many times. And so God put us together, and he began to give us some promises. One of the first promises he gave us was, I will take you to places you've never heard of. Wow. Well, I'd never traveled. When I was still in Zimbabwe, I'd never traveled out of that country. Now being in South Africa, I'd never traveled anywhere else. Well, where exactly was it that I'd never heard of? I wondered where it was going to be. But in time, God began to show exactly where it was at. God gave us a son. Previously, I'd had 3 daughters, so this was my first son. It wasn't a big deal that I had to have a son, but it was wonderful. God gave us a son together, and we were working and living together happily. And then somebody invited me, a relative, to go overseas, to go and help him in his business with my computer expertise. At first, it was going to be in the Caribbean, which was exciting because the Caribbean is a holiday paradise. But eventually, we ended up in Mexico, and so we came to Mexico, where the Mexican sleeps under the cactus with a sombrero over his head. Yes, they do have a lot of that in Mexico, but Mexico is a lot more modern, and you realize, but why did God bring us to Mexico? At first, it was wonderful. We were given a monthly income to live comfortably, and I felt like I was retired. We were living right by the coast. You could look out over the sea. We were just a couple of blocks away from the sea. It was wonderful. Everything was going great. And then, bam, financial problems struck again. My source dried up. I could no longer get an income, and I was stuck in Mexico, where I was not allowed to work under the visa conditions I had. So we had to find a way of income, and God pushed me out of my dream of retirement into what he took me there for, which was ministry. And so I decided that what I would do is I would begin to preach into camera. Now, at that time, I only had a couple of family members with us. Originally, Daphne and John and I went over with my younger daughter, who was still with us. And that's all that there was. And then the Lord led that I would bring my eldest daughter and her husband and family over to join us as well. And so I began to preach into camera, again, using the teaching ministry that God had given me. And we started to give lectures into camera. We were in a place where everybody spoke Spanish, not English. We couldn't even build a church or get people. So there were 6 of us and the kids. And so I had to preach just to a very small group of people into camera. I enjoyed pulpit ministry. I enjoyed preaching to crowds of people, but it's not so exciting when you have to preach to a small group of people. But I learned to preach to the camera as though I was preaching to a crowd. And God began to give us revelation. All the training and knowledge I'd had on the prophetic ministry, God began to show me things from his word and in the spirit concerning the ministry of the prophet. And so I began to do a series of teachings, amongst others, on the prophetic calling and the prophetic ministry. And over time, that developed into quite a few. There was something like 35 different lectures on the prophetic ministry. And we felt it was time to make this available to the world. And so the only access we had to the world at that time was via the internet. We couldn't work with any real people locally. And so we got onto the internet and we began to put our materials online, and we began to construct online training schools. Firstly, the prophetic, and then the Lord showed me about the apostolic, put me through an intense training, and I was placed in the apostolic office and began a full training on the apostolic calling as well. And so as we began to reach out more and meet people from the nations, God began to give us contacts of people that we could work with. And I established a ministry. I gave it a name. I called it Global Ministry Resources International. The idea being that we would produce ministry resources and give it out to the nations. Teaching was my ministry. I started to teach and produce so many of these ministries. And so God began to bring us people from around the world. One of the main sources was the little country of Switzerland. God began to bring us people from Switzerland, and eventually Switzerland became one of our main contacts. And with what God had given us, we began to show the leaders there how to set up a church the way I believe God wanted the church to be run. And so God began to bring us people. We began to visit in Switzerland and hold conferences. And even now today, 2 of our staff come from Switzerland. Isn't that amazing? Thank God for Switzerland. Okay. What happened then is God brought us a lot of people who began to look to me as a spiritual parent, and we gathered together like a kind of a spiritual family all around the world. Okay. And so I found that now that we were working more with apostles, global ministry resources was just a small part of what we were doing. We needed to embrace something much bigger. So I changed the name of our ministry to Apostolic Movement International, AMI. And so we established AMI, and we began to train the apostles and the prophets. Firstly, online, we began to hold ministry conferences where people would come to receive live training. We began to have people come and live with us for a few months in our home. We had a large home with spare rooms where we could train them and give them hands-on training. And everything was going great, and God had built up this whole training for the apostles and the prophets. And then suddenly the Lord changed my direction. You're going to hear this many times. The Lord said, I want you to learn about business. Well, business was necessary. Our finances were really difficult. We were struggling from a bit of money that we got from selling these courses online, but things weren't going that well. And so God began to teach me about business. I had been in business before we went over to Mexico. I'd been in my own computer business, and the Lord wanted to teach me principles about how to do business His way. And so it got to the point where the Lord said, I want you to hand the ministry division over to your daughter and son-in-law, and I want you to devote yourself completely to waiting on me to learn new things and to teach and produce new materials for business. And so over a period of 3 years, I began to preach many different subjects, which eventually accumulated together to become an entire course, which I entitled The Fivefold Business Calling. It wasn't just about business as usual, about how to make money. It was about how to see the accumulation of finances being something that God can specifically anoint and use, and that it can be an actual calling from the Lord. Well, after 3 years, and I had completed that training, I said, Lord, where do we go from now? He said, I want you to establish that now as a school, but I want you to bring it all together. It showed me that there were two different roads I've been walking, a ministry road and a business road. I'd stepped off the ministry road for a while and had walked the business road. He said, now I want you to bring the two roads together so that there is a complete presentation of both ministry calling and business calling, all dovetailing together. Well, I was quite excited about that. I came back to my daughter and son-in-law and said, hey guys, you've done a great job running the ministry. Let's get back together again and move into this new thing that God has for us. And I'm afraid my son-in-law was not happy about that at all. He got used to being the big shot and being in control of my ministry that I'd handed over to them. People started to look to him, and he began to rise up, get recognition. He was not ready to step back and give that back to me again. Well, that was sad, and it hurt me. But I looked to the Lord, and the Lord said, leave them. Step away. I'm going to give you something new. Again, a drastic change in my life. I stepped away from the ministry that I'd spent years building. All the resources that I'd built, I left with them. All my books and my tapes and everything that we created, I left with them while I did the business. And now I was on my own. And so I established a brand new ministry, and I called it Global Business Ministries, combining business and ministry together. And so came GBMI, which is where we still are right now. Those were the first beginnings of GBMI. But having lost all of my ministry resources, which were producing income, the ministry schools that were producing income, we were now in a desperate situation in Mexico. We could no longer justify our reason for being in the country. We couldn't produce sufficient financial income to justify us renewing our visas, and we were told we had to leave. Well, there was only one place we could go, and that was back to our homeland of South Africa. It was a very tough move. We had to give up everything that we'd accumulated for over 17 years, all our equipment, everything, because all we could take with us had to be in 2 suitcases. That's all we could take with us. And so we sold up everything, gave a lot away to the work of the Lord, and we stepped out and arrived here in South Africa with 2 suitcases each of what we could fit in them. And we started all over again. We began to establish now live training school classes. Whereas before we were doing it all only on the internet, now we could actually set up live classes. God gave us a home with a huge garage. We could seat about 50 people. We began to set up tables and chairs and lecture arrangements. We began to teach students. And so we started first with the Prophetic School because everybody loves prophetic ministry. Everybody wants to be a prophet. It's still very much out there in the body of Christ. And so we started with a Prophetic School. We started to enroll live students, and that produced an income for us. But now we could work with them face to face. After that, it was time to then establish additional teachings. And we'd had already a whole set of materials for an apostolic school, so we could start an apostolic school. But I also needed to get additional materials to minister to to teach some of the other ministries. We'd majored on the apostles and prophets, but what about the teachers and the pastors and the evangelists? So we had an apostolic school, a prophetic school, and a business school, but there was nothing for the pastors. And so firstly, the Lord had me establish an apostolic school and to complete all new training. And I repreached and added a whole series of teachings. And eventually we had 2 full years of prophetic training and 2 full years of apostolic training where we could take people from the basics up into a mature ministry. And then I started a prophetic school, a pastoral school, and we went again 1 year, 2 years, and established now a pastoral school. And then also we had the business training going as well. So here we were all set up. We had our apostolic school, our prophetic school, our pastoral school, our business school. Wow, Lord, I think I finally found my place. This is what you've been preparing me for all these years. Let's get going. And one day the Lord said, I want you to give up the schools. I want you to close them down. Well, that wasn't new. God done that to me a few times already. A big change was coming once again. By that time, Nadine, who had been my spiritual daughter, been living with us for many years from Mexico days, she began to rise up in the ranks as she was trained, eventually became a lecturer in those schools, and finally she was ready to take over some of the classes from me. And so as she progressed further and further, the time came when the Lord said, she's ready now to take the helm, and I want you to make her principal of the live schools. So I appointed Nadine as the principal. I remained behind, not as the principal, but just as the guy who's sort of owns it, the chancellor, okay? And so Nadine began to get involved more and more. While I was finishing the pastoral school, she was doing the prophetic and the apostolic. And then once I had finished the pastoral school, I said, Lord, what now? And one day as we were praying, we saw a vision. Nadine saw the vision. She saw a bird with fire. Wow, I thought that must be the Holy Ghost. I've been waiting to God for his power. I've been a teacher for so long, I wanted to move in the power of God. But as we looked at it closely, we realized it was actually a symbolic bird, which is known as the phoenix. You know the story of the phoenix? The phoenix burns itself up in its nest, according to tradition. And then after a while, from the ashes, there arises a new phoenix. And the Lord said, let go of what I've given you. Let it die, because I've got something new coming for you. So I went through a season of death for a long while. I didn't know where I was at. I was waiting on the Lord. And during that time, God began to show me to have an emphasis more on his power than on his word. Okay? And so over time, more and more, God began to take me into the realm of the Spirit and into the power gifts, into healing and miracles, and looking at the power of God and how that was going to work. And the Lord said, now it's time for the new phoenix to arise. And after many months, the Lord showed me a new phoenix coming up out of the ashes. Not the same bird, and yet similar. He said, you're going to be different to what you were before. Well, how different? I've been a teacher for all of my known life and ministry. How was that going to change? Well, it took me a while to get it. During that time, I felt it was time for us to expand and to get GBM out into the world. And so some of those people that God had brought us from the nations who had risen up as leaders, we asked them if they'd like to be in charge of a branch of Global Business Ministries International. And so we established branches in various different countries. And now I felt that the ministry had come to a place where I couldn't take it any further. And eventually the Lord spoke very loud and clear. And he said, I want you to not only hand over the entire training mantle to Nadine, but I want you to step away from it and let it go. Well, I've been doing that progressively, but I was still holding the reins. I was still in charge and in control and the owner of all these things. And so recently the Lord said to me, I want you to start thinking of using the word retire. Yeah, it's kind of like he pushed me. He said, you're getting old. You can't do what you used to do. Start handing this over to the young uns. Well, it was time to establish GBMI officially in the country. We were running unofficially. It was time to establish it. I don't believe in establishing a ministry where we are reliant on the government for tax break and government controls us. I always believed a ministry should rather be established as a business where we pay Caesar his amount and we have control. And so we decided to establish Global Business Ministries International, registered as a business in South Africa. And the logical thing was for Daphne and I to be the principals of that business. But there again, there was a lot of hiccups with paperwork and red tape and all sorts of things. And in the end, I said, the easiest things, let's just hand this over to John and let him register the business in his name and handle all the finances. And that's what God wanted. And so I even had to let go of that part I was controlling. I had to let go of the financial side and all of that. I let go of the ministry side. Lord, what am I going to do? I thought, I reached a point, I thought, am I going to die now, Lord? Am I going to die now? Because I always said I'll stop ministering when I stop breathing. The Lord said, no, I've got something new for you. So those of you who know me, and you know us, you know that recently I made an announcement that I was stepping down from the leadership of GBMI and holding the reins, and that Daphne and I were together going to start something new. Now we're about to do that. It's going to be very different, and I'm going to be sharing with you in due course some of our goals and plans for that, but I've taken up enough time sharing my story. I think it's time Daphne shares her story so you see the picture of how God brought us together and how God is going to use us together, and then I'm going to let you know what some of our plans are for the future, okay?